Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's happy hour for the Civil War doc. Tonight, our guest is Dr. Angela Esco Elder. She is an associate professor at Converse University in Spartanburg, South Carolina. She got her BA, MA, and PhD all from the University of Georgia. So big dogs fan, I'm assuming.
Yep.
Her specialty is in Civil War and women's history, and her book will be coming out next month by the University of North Carolina Press. It is called Love and Duty, Confederate Widows and the Emotional Politics of Loss. Obviously, I haven't read it yet because I haven't got my hands out on it, but we're so excited to have you, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, fantastic. I am going to try to share my screen. It says host to disabled participant screen sharing.
No, I did not.
Okay. I figured I would throw pictures and quotes at y'all for about 10 minutes and then we could talk, but
you should be good to go.
Okay. Oh, I am the host now. Okay. There it goes. All right. Let's see here. Yay. Okay, can y'all see that?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, so hi. Yes, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I have so many questions for you all, including why would you choose to spend a lovely Friday evening talking about death and grief, which is why I put happy hour ? Because I really don't know that tonight's going to be all that happy with the content and the book and all of that. But I'm really excited to be here. The book has been a long time.
Uh-oh.
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. I think I lost you. Hold on. Let me try sharing again. We'll see if it works. Okay. Yay. And y'all can see that again? Okay, great. All right. So I was just saying how excited I am to be here. So let's see if I can get there it goes. When I talk about this with my undergraduate students, we typically play a game with this number where they guess all sorts of different things, right? As undergraduate students do, before they finally settle on the fact that roughly 750,000 men died in the American Civil War. And we come to this knowing this is America's bloodiest war. We have some concept of that, but I challenge my students with how often do we stop about what that actually means as far as how that changes families, how that changes societies, and the magnitude of this across the United States. And so we talk about the various ways that soldiers die in the American Civil War, and trying to complicate some of their preconceptions, talk a lot about disease, and usually settle upon this quote, which is one of my favorites, one of those infamous war quotes, right, by Whitman that just sinks into your bones, this idea of so much death, that death is just everywhere across the South. And I use that as my jumping off point to eventually shift into this conversation about widowhood, that if approximately 28% of the men were married, which is a statistic that seems most likely, that would leave us with roughly 200,000 widows across the nation. We think about the Civil War and we think about the South, it's helpful to recognize how death is weighing heavily on so many families that are mourning cousins, and that we can see it physically on the landscape, not only with the wardrobe, which I'll talk about in a little bit, of the people, but also with the buildings that are being draped in Black fabric, also with the church bells that are constantly ringing for funerals. And so there's a lot to talk about. For time's sake, I'm just going to focus on 3 topics, and then we can expand it outwards in our conversation tonight to get us all on the same foundation. And I'll give you a few examples of widows. And again, I have lots more stories we can talk about depending on where your interests and your questions lie. So the book starts with marriages. And usually I start this conversation with marriage, since you can't be a widow unless you were once married. And one thing that happens at the outbreak of the Civil War and at the outbreak of many wars is there is this rush to the altar that so many soldiers who are marching off want to have that security and want to be married. And the women are interested in this too. So here's one example from a girl in Charleston, South Carolina. One looks at a man so differently when he might be killed tomorrow. Men whom up till this time I had thought dull and commonplace seemed charming, right? So there is this huge rush to the altar. And because of that, we have a situation where many widows are 17, 18, 19 years old. Some widows really didn't know the men that they had married all that well. And some widows are pregnant. Some widows are expected to mourn longer than they were even married. And so an example of this would be Hetty Carey, who lived in Richmond, Virginia. She gets married towards the tail end of the war in January of 1865. She's known as the Belle of Richmond. There's much excitement over this wedding. On the night of her wedding, there are all these bad omens. She breaks a mirror, she tears her veil, the horses won't go, and so she arrives late and all of this sort of thing. But by her records, by her writings, everything was wonderful. Everything was happy. She gets married, and very quickly her husband is shot. And so she finds herself in the exact same church with the exact same people who were at her wedding 3 weeks later to the date at her husband's funeral. And she is going to be a widow for 15 years. So she is one of these examples of someone who's going to mourn a lot longer than she was even married. Which brings us to this idea of, well, what was expected, right? What were the mourning ideals? How did the Civil War keep things the same, and how did they challenge them? And so most of us are familiar, thanks to Drew Gilpin Faust, with the good death, this idea that death should happen at the end of a person's life, that it would be at home, that there are all of these rituals surrounding it, that your family will be there, that it's peaceful, there are final words. And we know that the Civil War destroys this. The Civil War shatters the good death. By its very nature, the good death is not going to happen. So this is one quote from a newspaper in North Carolina, this idea, the whole nation is a vast house of mourning. Christmas, once so merry and joyous, finds the widow and her little ones clustered together in grief. This idea, if you skim down a little bit, that the United States has turned into this vast human slaughter pen. And so when I started reading through all of these letters and diaries and speeches and newspapers related to widowhood, I tried to get a sense of, well, how did this affect women, right? What were they supposed to do? And then what did the reality look like? And what I found is that the Confederacy especially doubles down on what they want their widows to do. They can't control death. They can't control how men are dying, but maybe they can control how mourning is happening back home. And that becomes invested with all sorts of importance. There are a number of ideals. One is that a widow is supposed to mourn for 2.5 years. Husbands are supposed to mourn for 3 months if their wives die. So little disparity there, but 2.5 years for widows. They should dress in black in mourning, the idea that they're outside and what they're wearing reflects their emotions on the inside. And we see lots of examples of widows, even if they can't afford mourning clothing, trying to dye the clothes that they have black. For that 2.5 years, they should not remarry. They should not flirt. They should not dance. They should not be courting. A Confederate soldier is supposed to be irreplaceable, not something easily replaced. So as you can imagine, Scarlett O'Hara not fitting with the ideals here, and we'll return back to her in a little bit in pop culture. But as the Confederacy is outlining this, they would have been horrified by her in many ways. Widows are supposed to devote themselves to motherhood and children if they have them. As I mentioned, many widows are pregnant. Many of the women will name their children after their late husbands. There's going to be a lot of tension between widows and their mothers-in-law. That's a whole section in the book that we can dive deeper into in a little bit. But the children, right? The children become especially important. That's a direct connection, a direct bloodline to the late husband. And so motherhood gains even more importance. And then religion, for those of us that have spent time reading a lot of letters of soldiers, you might notice that at the bottom, many soldiers sign their letters, "May we meet again in heaven," or something along those lines, and they'll circle it. So this idea of finding comfort in a reunion in heaven and devoting and finding peace to this idea that God will strengthen you was a big part of the ideals for mourning. And then for the Confederacy, what I found is that it became increasingly important for widows to devote themselves to the Confederacy publicly. And this is what I spend a lot of time in my book arguing, this idea that if a widow loses her husband, if he dies in the war, and she can still support the cause that killed him, that is a really powerful endorsement for the Confederacy. But if she says no, right, the cause isn't worth it, enough is enough, send home my brothers, send home my father, send home my male cousins, that's a powerful indictment. And so letters and newspapers and speeches are all glorifying these widows who mourn well, who say that they wish that they could go off and fight now that their husband is gone and take his place and all of that sort of thing. They're glorifying this type of widow. And widows who are playing that part are using the social capital they gain to get all sorts of things that they want. And so my example of that is Emily Todd Helm. Everybody knows one widow from the Civil War, Mary Todd Lincoln, a first lady who is almost so defined by mourning that you rarely see her not dressed in black, right? She loses her son during the war. She loses two brothers during the war, and then ultimately loses her husband. And we lose a lot of who Mary Lincoln was as this witty, politically savvy, ambitious young wife. Instead, all we get is Mary in mourning, Mary as a woman who's driven, quote unquote, mad by her grief. And Mary is just one of the widows in the Todd family. There's also her younger sister, Emily. So when Abraham Lincoln talks about a house being divided, he's not just talking about the nation. He's talking about his wife's family. He's talking about his in-laws, and he's talking especially about Emily, who becomes a widow when she is 26 years old. She has 3 children under the age of 6. She's in Georgia at the time when this happens, and she wants to get back home to Kentucky, where she's from, where her mother is. But of course, Kentucky is a border state, Union state. She would have to cross the lines, and she gets stuck. She gets held up. And the Union officers say that they will only let her pass if she will swear an oath of allegiance to the United States. And she refuses, right? Her husband just died fighting for the Confederacy. She's not going to uphold it in word or action. And because she's so famous, because everyone knows that she's Lincoln's sister-in-law, they telegraph him, and he responds with one line, "Send her to me." And so we have this situation where a Confederate widow is now in the White House. And at first, Emily finds a lot of comfort in her grief with Mary, in her grief with Abraham Lincoln. As you can see from a couple of quotes here, this idea that they find comfort within one another, but still the politics is going to divide them. And especially for the people who are coming into the White House who are very suspicious of Emily, they are going to challenge her being there. And so this is one example of Senator Harris from New York, Senator of New York, who is challenging her. Well, we ripped the rebels at Chattanooga. The scoundrels ran like scared rabbits. As an example, Senator Harris, that you set them at Bull Run. If I had 20 sons, they should all be fighting the rebels. And if I had 20 sons, Senator Harris, they support. So these are the stories that get blown way out of proportion, right? These are the stories that the Confederacy, the late Confederacy, absolutely love. And this is what brings Emily her status in the South. She's eventually going to make her way back to Kentucky, but will live as almost a professional widow. She's constantly talking about her husband's memory. She's writing all of these lost cause stories. She's an organizer for the United Daughters of the Confederacy. She's married for 7 years. For 70 years, she is going to be the public widow of her husband. And so this is an example of an elite widow, right? Someone who had the time and the finances and the social grace to play her role perfectly. And so even though there are examples like this, like Emily, there are also thousands of widows who could not or refused to be the kind of widow that Emily was. And so that brings us to my third topic here, this idea of mourning realities, right? Lots of women are not able or not willing to mourn for 2.5 years, wear black, be accepting of the death, et cetera, right? Some of them are too poor. They immediately have to launch back into the workforce. They're too busy to mourn properly. They're just trying to survive being a widow, survive being a young mother in many cases. Some widows just aren't interested in this whole project. Perhaps barely knew the husband that they ended up marrying. And so we have lots of examples like this of widows who are immediately going back out, who are courting, who are flirting. Sydney Harding, her sister, is a widow. You can see she hopes that her sister would have been more dignified and was very disappointed. Another example, this idea that gloom reigns in the hearts and homes of most our people, widows and widowers were the only ones having a gay time. And then a story from a Union soldier here, a chaplain actually, who was in Tennessee, and his purpose was to recruit enslaved men to his regiment. Supposedly encounters this Tennessee widow who is just so beautiful, he forgets his entire purpose, right? This idea, a man would be a monster, could he deny an angel such as this? And then we also have a completely different category of widows, widows who are relieved to become widows, right? Death freed many women from bad marriages, from abusive husbands, from partners who they couldn't divorce, though they tried. So there are some examples that I was able to find of women who were quietly celebrating widowhood as a release from unhappy marriages. A much smaller category there that I could find anyway. But for the most part, those that aren't living up to the ideals, it typically is because they find themselves so emotionally and physically traumatized by this war. The grief is so big, they're oblivious to the present, they're unable to recover, they're unwilling to support the Confederacy. And so one of the examples of this is a widow who, I don't actually have her name, a nurse records her story when she shows up at a hospital in Richmond in the middle of the night because she heard her husband had been wounded. And so she races there. Her husband has already passed away and she just loses it. She collapses to the ground. She's screaming and she's crying. She refuses to believe it. She insists that he be dug up until the following morning they go and do that. And again, she doesn't believe it until she sees his face, right? So for her and for widows like her, the Confederacy was not worth this sacrifice. And they're not really interested in being part of this larger political project. And so to wrap it up, right, the question we always ask our students is this: so what, right? Why does it matter? Why do Confederate widows matter? Especially when so many of them were involved and enslaved people, when their husbands are literally fighting the United States of America. And I would say for a few reasons, I would argue for a few reasons, right? So first of all, analyzing the experience of Confederate widows changes the way that we think about the Civil War household. Even though they share a gender, women do not wound the same. They do not work the same, and they don't have the same strengths and weaknesses. And these differences emerge particularly when their relationships are put under stress, right? A second thing I spend a lot of the book talking about is emotions and how much emotion matters, that the political is personal, that the personal is political, that this leaves a lasting impression on both Confederate officials and on widows' communities. They aren't just widows, they are war widows, they are Confederate widows, and that carries with it all sorts of obligations and status and society connections. And then I was also fascinated by this idea of Scarlett O'Hara. How do we have tens of thousands of women who are widowed by the war, who basically disappear? There's very little academic scholarship on this, and then reemerge as Scarlett O'Hara in our popular culture. And so that was a question that just haunted me the whole time I was doing this and as I was digging through it. And the way that I open the book and the way I'll tie it up now before I throw it up for questions is this dedication from Jefferson Davis, right, in his history of the Confederate government. And I'm always struck by the fact that he doesn't dedicate it to the veterans who fought. He doesn't dedicate it to the soldiers who died. Instead, he dedicates it to the women who are mourning. And I think that's worth noting. So I'm gonna stop sharing. I'll stop there. So yeah, questions, comments, what do y'all want to talk about?
Hi, Angela. I'm so sorry I don't have my my video on. I'm really sick right now.
Oh
I'm
no.
I'm really so happy to have you. I don't know, people probably don't know this, but Angela and I were actually in grad school together. She's of course a few years younger than me, but we were really good friends, and we've kind of lost touch in the last few years with everything. But I'm so happy to see you, and I'm so excited about this book. I think it's going to be, make a big splash. And I'm also thinking like maybe we can even release this video on the book release day too to everybody, and really push some book sales. But I was wondering, I see the through lines from your work to Karen Cox's work in a lot of ways. And so I don't know if you get that far, but if you even like know from research that's not in the book, how it kind of relates to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have one chapter on Reconstruction. I made the classic graduate student mistake that I went in to all of these archives and I was like, I'm writing a Civil War story. And then after graduate school went, wait a minute, I can't, this story doesn't end in 1865 and I need all of this other stuff that I didn't get when I was in the archives. So I only have one chapter. So it really only goes through Ladies Memorial Association for the most part. But what I found, and I would love to play more with this in the future, although I don't know that I think I might choose a happier topic for my next book, but I'm fascinated by the seeds of what I found, which is that when we look at the Ladies Memorial Association, especially, it is not widows for the most part who are leading, at least in my research that I found, it is not widows who is leading that project. For the most part, it is women whose families remain intact. And a lot of women who are widows are openly challenging a lot of what the Ladies Memorial Association is doing. And they're saying, we don't need any more monuments. We don't need things that are made out of stone. We need to be fed. We need jobs. We need support. We are the living memorial of all of this, right? And I think that's fascinating. I think there's a lot there. I mean, certainly there are some exceptions, right? Typically very elite widows are much more involved in this project. But if we're talking rank and file, only show up once, if we're looking at the newspapers, if we're looking at a lot of the speeches, especially the speeches that are tied to the widows' homes that are being built for the widows and the orphans of the Confederacy, there's also against some of the other projects that are happening at the exact same time and saying, I mean, even writing things and publishing them in the newspaper about, if you cared about the soldiers and their families, what would they want you to do? They'd want you to take care of these living, breathing people who are struggling. And there certainly was a lot of hardship during Reconstruction, to the point where at one point, there's so many dark stories. I was going through a newspaper and I found a story of a widow who's at work and her two sons went to go bathe and they drowned. And I read it and I'm like, I'm not putting this in my book. And I was really mad about it. And I just kept going. And then of course was like, this really matters. And this fits into my argument. And this shows a lot of the struggle that I'm trying to point to. And then couldn't find it and spent like 3 days trying to find that one paragraph in that one newspaper that I didn't take. But right, it conflicts. And I do think it connects a lot. Carrie Janey is doing or has done. So yeah. Anyway.
Dr. Elder, thank you so much for joining us, by the way. I wanted to ask, so you were talking about kind of, that there was this expectation placed on Confederate women of kind of how they were supposed to act in mourning, and kind of be supportive to the Confederate cause, if you will. Did you find any evidence of that kind of changing over time as the war went on, like as the deaths just kept mounting and you know, did kind of later in the war women just kind of start to kind of break that mold more often than the beginning, or is that
Yeah.
something that you just weren't able to find?
That's a great question. Honestly, no, because for each widow, I mean, that was her first death. That was her husband who has died. And so some widows clung to it, and some widows loved the rituals, or appreciate, I shouldn't say loved, appreciated, right? So when everything else is thrown to the wind and you don't know what to cling to, it helped to have a prescription of these, I need to find a black dress, and I need to do this, and I need to do that. And so for some widows, it did seem to bring some comfort. Again, it just points to the tremendous variety in grief, which I think we're seeing a lot in our modern world right now too, right? That what works for one family doesn't work for another family.
Right.
But throughout the war, if anything, it almost seems to ramp up. You have Jefferson Davis talking about how important it is to support widows. You have widows who are starting to recognize that they can play this to their advantage. So they're writing to their local governments, they're writing to state governments and saying, I gave my husband to the cause. I need food, I need a job, I need support, all of that sort of thing. So yes, it really seems pretty consistent as far as the ideals. There's certainly more flexibility about the clothing. There wasn't much criticism if a widow couldn't afford to wear black. But there's also all of this language. It seems like a lot of widows wanted to, and they're writing to their family members, what was the dye that you used, and can I get any of that in order to, transform the clothing that they did have.
So fascinating. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Here, when Carrie Lee was talking, let me share my screen again. I forgot I was going to show y'all, and I'll put it in here too for the people who may watch it in the future, although I don't know if the code will still be good in the future, but I'll cross my fingers that it is. But UNC did give me this 40% off discount code, 01DAH40. So hopefully that will work for anyone who is interested through the UNC site. Anyway, do that while I was thinking about it. Okay.
Hey, Dr. Elder. I wanted to ask, I'm in Charlotte, and I didn't grow up here. I grew up further west in North Carolina, but found out after moving here that Stonewall Jackson's widow, Anna, lived here for basically like 40 years after the war, had a house downtown close to the train station, and was sort of like the Beyonce of Confederate widows. Like people would just come to see her.
Oh.
So you mentioned the elites earlier. Like, did she have any agency, or, given like her prominence, like, did she just have to play along, or do you have any indication either way?
I think she was someone. Hey, sorry, I think I dropped y'all for a second. Okay, yeah, she was someone that widows definitely resonated with, and so she is fascinating for all sorts of reasons, and the way that she tries to shape her husband's memory, especially after the Civil War, and that's something that a lot of widows are doing. They try to manipulate things to be as favorable as possible. Some widows like her, I think, loved to be on a stage and enjoyed being public figures. Emily Todd Helm falls in that same thing. She goes so many places, and I think she just enjoyed that. That was her community. Jackson is fascinating because a lot of people will cut out articles, lots of widows. So some of the things I looked at, I mean, letters and diaries, of course, but I was trying to really get outside of that source space as much as I could. And so for some women, all I could find in the archives was their scrapbooks. And the number of women that had articles cut and pasted about her was fascinating. And so I think one on its own, maybe not that notable, but there were at least 10 or 15 scrapbooks that I found that widows had specifically cut out either something about her husband's death or something about where she was or visiting, or if she was giving a talk or something like that, and they glued it into their scrapbooks. So I do think a lot of women resonated with her as someone who had similarly gone through grief and was trying to put their lives back together. So.
It seems like, I mean, as you said earlier, this is such a timely topic. As we're literally about to hit 1 million deaths, and it's still obviously, you try to make people understand the proportion. The numbers were less in the Civil War, but literally the proportion of people who died was so much higher. What was it, like one in 5 men in the South, pretty much? What, I know this is like the $1 million question, but I'm sure you've thought about this, writing it over the last few years. What do you think some of the lessons can be for us today? And how to mourn even?
Yeah. I mean, I think if we're looking at today, right, this is something that is going to haunt us in ways, and I don't even think we realize how much it's going to haunt us, right? I mean, so I teach at Converse University, who has been pretty strict about a lot of our protocols. Today was our very first day that was mask optional in the classroom. And walking into the classroom where I would say 75% of my students have elected not to wear a mask, just thinking about this is the first time in 2 years that I've seen their faces, and just, the whole time I'm teaching. And of course, it just happens to be when I'm teaching about the 1920s and flappers and all of the things, right? And I'm just like, wow, this is going to take so much time for me to process. And in some ways, I think today there's such a push that we just want to move past this, that I don't know that we're giving every family the time that they need to mourn. But again, it's so individualized. But if we think about it from a scope perspective, I think it's going to show up in ways that we don't expect. Yeah. I don't know. I'm watching it very closely too. I do see a lot of echoes here. And in some ways, I don't know, the Confederacy was it was trying so hard after the war, right, to put itself back together. And I think part of what drew me to this project is this idea, right? I fell into this story of widowhood, is that the Union certainly had so many widows as well, United States, but they win the war, right? So like the sacrifice is worth it. And one of the things I just came back to with the Confederacy is that emotional labor of how do you process the fact that like you signed up, you were part of this war project. And then on top of losing a husband, you also lose the war and you have to put those pieces back together. And it's traumatic. It's traumatic in all sorts of different ways. The story that launched me into this, I was in John Esco's community studies class as a master's student. I needed a project. I didn't know what I wanted to do in graduate school, something with women, something with war, but I didn't know what. And so I went to the University of Georgia archives back when it was still in the library, which I loved because it was old and dusty and just like exactly what you think of when you think of the archival experience. The new building is lovely now too, but anyway. And so I was just pulling boxes and I was reading through who's fighting for the Confederacy. And then all of a sudden there's this tiny slip of paper and it's the telegram. And it's not even to her telling her that her husband had died. It's to her neighbor because Rosa is pregnant. And so it says something like, on account of her condition, basically tell her carefully. And they already had 3 children. This was their 4th child. And so the child, it was a little girl, is born a month later. And the widow, Rosa, is just obsessed with, she wants her husband's body back in Georgia. She wants it in the Oconee Cemetery. She wants to have a place to mourn with the family, all of that. And so for 3 years, she's basically on this letter writing campaign, trying to get him home. And then the 4th child, the little girl that the father never met, dies, whooping cough, right? And then a month later, she's able to get her husband's body reinterred in the Oconee Cemetery. And so if you go there today, right, you see these 2 graves. I mean, and there's this whole story between there of mourning and grief and the ways that it intertwines, but it's something so physical and so public. And that, I don't know. I feel like we don't have that yet with COVID. I'm trying to figure out what direction it's going to go in our modern world. Like for her, having that space was so important. And she had a community of people who were also mourning. And the communities seem like they're so different today and they're so political that I feel like I don't know, Carrie Lee. that was me rambling. There you go. I will think about it more as well. It's been on my mind.
I want to point out that Elizabeth Taylor did pose a couple questions in the chat.
Oh, okay. Hold
Yeah.
on. Let me pull it. Great. Was spiritualism as popular in the South as it was in the North? I don't know comparison wise if it was more or less popular, but it certainly was popular that there were widows who were interested in connecting and that physical connection, both through spiritualism and in all sorts of other ways too, which I think is both Union and Confederate, right? This idea that they wanted something physical to prove that their loved one was gone. Lots of women writing things like, I'm so glad he died in clothes that we knew, or that we have the lock of hair. And the hair jewelry that is so popular, especially at this moment, having something physical. And so I think the spiritualism is just an outgrowth, right, of all of that, of wanting to have some connection, especially if there wasn't a grave to physically mourn or a body to visit. Was widowhood compounded by the reality that these mothers had children die? I think so. Yes. Death is certainly something that was part of 19th century life, and very intimate and taking place at home. So I think for the widows that had children after their husbands had passed away, there seems to be a particularly strong connection with a lot of those children. They're almost always married. They're almost always named after their late husband if they are a boy. And some widows, like there's this one widow, Tivy Stevens in Florida, her husband's name was Winston. So she names the little boy Winston, who's born. She loses her husband, and then her mother dies like 2 days later. And then the little boy is born like 2 weeks later, very premature, but survives. And she names the little boy Winston, but then she refuses to call him Winston. She can't bring herself to it. She calls him Winnie his entire life. Her sister, the widow's sister, is like, don't call him Winnie. That's a girl's name. That's an ugly name. Like, call him after the man after whom the father after whom he was named. And she just can't do it. So there's all sorts of connections that are playing out. Yeah, that's a great question, Elizabeth.
Did the were the women, the widows whose husbands died in battle, was it different than those whose husbands died of disease or other causes?
Great question. I don't see it as much. I went into it thinking, right? Because I mean, right, you think of Gone with the Wind. She makes such a big deal about how he dies, that it wasn't this gallant battlefield death, but it was disease. But when I was going through the records for the widows, it doesn't seem to make as big of a difference. Of course, there's one widow in particular from Alabama whose husband dies of disease before he even gets to battle. And she is just shattered by this, right? He didn't even fight, right? He just got sick as soon as he got to camp, and she couldn't get there in time. But that I would say is an outlier, that it doesn't seem it. So for the letters that widows are receiving, the condolence letters, they are always saying brave husband, honorable husband, gallant husband, even if he died of dysentery or something along those lines. It doesn't seem as linked to the manner in which they went. So here, I can show y'all this. Let me zoom forward a little here. Oh no, I lost y'all. Sorry, too many tabs. We're getting better at Zoom every day. The title of the book, let me pull it over. So UNC Press, I loved working with UNC. They were absolutely wonderful. But holy smokes, the title, we went back and forth so many times because the dissertation was called Married to the Confederacy. And I originally had these paired chapter segments that I absolutely loved, to have and to hold till death do us part, et cetera, et cetera. And I loved it. But then the book went into so many revisions to make it stronger, and especially adding that Reconstruction chapter that didn't really work. And then we wanted to name it something different than the dissertation to reflect all of these edits. And then we just couldn't decide. I'm so sorry. I don't know if that's my connection that's doing that or what, but if it is my connection, I'm sorry. Okay. So I was saying we were going back and forth about all of the different titles until eventually this poem I found after the manuscript's done. So it's not in the book anywhere else, but it is in the front of the book, which I'm excited about. And what I actually loved about it was the last line kind of on that first page at the where it says, and send them forth to die. But UNC was not a fan of send them forth to die. So instead, when we went through it, we settled on this image of love and duty, and especially that second stanza, if y'all can see it, right? This idea of love, the true and the brave, the beautiful, the strong, wrestling with duty, and wrestling, and then falling at the feet of duty, bleeding out of every opening vein. And I think that captures a lot of the tension in this book. And again, of course, not all widows were heartbroken. Not all of them loved their husbands. Some of them had really rotten husbands. But for many widows, this emotion of love and duty and how they interact with one another, and how ultimately duty is what wins out, right? Their husbands did go to fight, whether they wanted them to or not. And some of them really did want them to, hardcore Confederate through and through, some of them more lukewarm to it. And ultimately, that's what they're left with because of duty. Now, the whole idea of what's next is going to stay with them. So there's that. And then here I have that too. There are the chapters. So you can kind of see the through line that we have a chapter on antebellum, chapter on weddings, and then the rest of it is focused on that experience of widowhood. So yeah. Okay.
So you mentioned earlier, and it kind of just piqued my curiosity about kind of these widows having to a lot of times, the relationships with their in-laws, especially, and like if they had children, like did you find like any kind of like if, for instance, like court records of like like custody disputes or thing, or like things of that nature? Like what did women or widows go through during this time with in those certain situations?
Yeah, great question. So informally, I did not find court records, but a lot of letters revealed a lot of tension with the in-laws. And again, because maybe one day my mother-in-law will watch this, not all in-law relationships were terrible, but there was a lot, especially again, for widows who are or for women who were relatively new into the family. The war threw a lot of things into flux because some wives did not want to move in with their in-laws as soon as the husband left. They didn't really know them all that well, or they may not care for them, or it might not be as good of a location. So some wives don't want to go to the in-laws family. They want to go back to their birth family. So that causes a little bit of tension between some of the in-laws who felt like, well, you're part of our family now and you should be living with us or living close to us. So that already started the tension. Then once the son was gone, right, we have two women who are mourning the same man. Less tension if the wife had been in the family a long time. But again, for those recent relationships, there often was a lot of tension between who had the greater claim to mourning, who should be getting the things, where he should be buried. A lot of interest in making sure that she's not moving on too quickly, a lot of judgment there. But it becomes most heated, like you just mentioned, when there's a child involved or when she's pregnant at the time, especially if that is the only child, right? So for this mother-in-law whose son has passed away, might only be, 22, 23 years old. And now this young woman is having the baby of her son who might look very similar to her child. The mother-in-law might be relatively young herself, maybe in her 40s, right? And so there's all of these really, really big dynamics that are going on here where the mother-in-law wants to be very close to that child. That is the child of her son and might be the only legacy that she has left. And so some widows will cling to that relationship. They will live with their in-laws. They will raise the child near their in-laws. There seems to be the happiest relationships there. But for the widows who do not want to live with their in-laws and don't want to move in with their in-laws, that causes a lot of tension and a lot of unhappiness. One widow says that she feels like, so she was living with her mother-in-law during the war, and they fought just constantly. Fought, and she's right her, and this woman, I don't like her, and we can't get along. And then the husband dies, and she says she feels like that was her punishment because she couldn't get along with this woman, right? And so now she's wrestling with all of this. And so yeah, it gets really complicated, these claims over mourning, because the widow does have the greatest claim, right? And society expects her to have the greatest claim. because typically these would have been much longer marriages. And so a mother is only supposed to have to mourn for a year, but a mother is also not supposed to outlive her son and not have so many mothers who are outliving their son. And it's an interesting dynamic, right? So we have, 750,000 ish people who die in the Civil War. We say, roughly 28% of them are married. Well, every single one of that 750,000 had a mom. I mean, she might not still be living, of course, but right. So the motherhood and the grieving of motherhood, but society doesn't give them. I mean, some of them have a stage, but not the stage that Confederate widows have, not the speeches in the press and all that's happening. Sometimes they're lumped together, the mothers and the widows, but at least from what I found in my survey of things, the widows take precedence and the mothers struggle with that. Some of them struggle very much with that, especially if the widow seems to be blocking them out. One of the things that I found when I was in grad school and just shocked by, right, we hear all of this language about the widow and the orphan, part of it biblical. But this idea in the 19th century that if a father dies, the child is an orphan. Doesn't matter that the mother's still alive. Doesn't matter that they're still living together, right? If the father dies, the child is orphaned. And so that also is part of the reason why I think so many in-laws are trying to have this really close relationship with that child, since that's all that's left of their son. So, yep.
So I know you've mentioned some of the sources you use, but I was just curious about, other sources, because I would think that these women are many of them so difficult to get at. That you had to be probably pretty creative.
Yeah. Yeah. So finding aids, shockingly, surprisingly to me when I started this, they don't often list widows. Sometimes I get close if it would mention that somebody died, and then I would track and see if they get married. I had many disappointing days in the archives, which sounds absolutely terrible, where I'd find this great letter collection between a husband and a wife, and then I'd find out he survived the war, which is great for him, but terrible for my research who had this. I was like, oh, this story is gonna work so well for me. And then I only focused within my research. I only focused on women whose husbands died during the American Civil War, right? I didn't go beyond that. And for that reason, pension records were actually not a great resource for me. I'm sure there are lots of stories there that are waiting. But because women in the South don't get a pension immediately after the Civil War, and it's so piecemeal by the states, and then by the time pensions are opened up to Confederate widows, it doesn't, their husbands might have died after the Civil War. And so for me, it was like a needle in a haystack that I would read through 30 or 40 pension applications from someone whose husband died after the war to get to the one of somebody's husband who died during the war. So I didn't rely too heavily on those because I was doing a lot with ideals and what the Confederacy wanted. I did a lot with newspapers. I did a lot with politicians' speeches, trying to get a sense of, well, what images are they putting before women bombarding communities with? And then a lot of it was just long and slow and steady slogging, right? So going through letters and diaries, both published and in archives, looking at a lot of nurses as well, because I wanted to try to get as many widows as possible who were not literate or financially wealthy. Harder source for me to get at, of course, for all of us to get at. So finding nurses who are writing about women, even finding other soldiers I would find talking about, so-and-so died, his wife is destitute, so I sent her what I could, or, a woman shows up and has absolutely nothing and is desperate and trying to find information about her husband or whatever, late husband. So a little bit of everything, as much as I could. For sure.
Did you find any evidence of women who faked widowhood for financial purposes?
Yeah, I did. So I found several during Reconstruction who are appearing in the newspapers who are supposedly trying to swindle communities by telling a sob story, and then find out she's not actually a widow, she's a con artist. During the Civil War, And we're back. So after the war and Reconstruction, yes, I found some in newspapers who were supposedly trying to con the system. During the war, one memorable story is two women who were arrested for prostitution, who then claim that they are widows. And the person who is writing this file says he does not believe they are widows. But they use that as a justification for why they had turned to this occupation, that they're so desperate that their husbands had died at Gettysburg. But he does end up letting them go. Says that, I guess it was a sympathetic enough story that anyway. So yes, there are some examples. I suspect there are more. If at least a few are already trickling in, then I bet some are successful at playing that story. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anybody else?
So I know how long the process of turning a book in and waiting for copy edits and all that kind of stuff. So I imagine you already kind of have your second book topic in mind and wanted, or at least like a general idea, and wanted to know what that might be.
I do. So, so my next project is going to be on 19th century Key West. And the way that I fell into this is very much a pandemic story, in that I have 3 young kids, and during the pandemic, we turned to camping since we weren't really going anywhere, right? And so I was looking at all of these national parks and state parks, and I live in South Carolina, so like within driving distance, we weren't flying anywhere, and stumbled across the dry tortugas down off the coast of Key West and the 3 forts that are down in Key West. And I was like, wow, this is a fascinating story, and started digging into that. I'm not sure what the story is yet, though. I'm still very preliminary. I don't know if it's a 19th century story of Key West, particularly looking at it through this lens of either persistence or determination. If we look at disease and hurricanes and piracy and just the struggle to survive on this island, at that time. So I don't know if that's my story. I don't know if I'll zoom in and look just at the dry tortugas and the fort there, which held, Union prisoners of war, was never taken by the Confederacy. And there's some good stuff there. There's one woman, Emily Holder, who has this fascinating narrative of what it's like to be there as a surgeon's wife throughout the Civil War. Her son is there, and she's this abolitionist who then has enslaved people working in her kitchen. And so Key West is this whole complicated story too, because the federal government is using enslaved people to build all of these forts, but then the USCT is stationed in Key West during the Civil War. So I don't know if that's my story. I don't know what my story is, but I'm having a lot of fun zooming in there, planning a camping trip in the future to take the whole family down at some point. And trying to decide which of these threads I'm going to pull on. So there is a widow story there. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of widow stories there. But when the lighthouse keeper, so she and her husband moved there in, I think, the 1830s. Don't quote me here, because I'm still getting into it, right? So they moved there in the 1830s. He dies, so she's the lighthouse keeper, and I think she's the only lighthouse keeper in the United States, female lighthouse keeper, who's climbing the stairs in Key West. And then a hurricane comes through, I think in 1847. Again, don't quote me, but and the lighthouse tips over, and supposedly she loses like half of her children. The whole island, I think all but 6 are wiped out by this hurricane. The coffins are like propped up against the trees, open, and it's just this, they have to completely rebuild. And the woman, the widow, continues to be the lighthouse keeper, and supposedly is the lighthouse keeper up through the Civil War. Key West is immediately seized by the United States. They can't lose Key West, right? Too important to the blockade and everything else. A rumor has it, according to the local stuff, is that this woman, who's got to be in her 80s at this point, is a hardcore, ardent Confederate, and eventually gets removed from this federal position of lighthouse keeper, which she's done for decades because she will not shut her mouth about the Confederacy. So something with that. Stay tuned. I'm hoping to get down there this summer.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for tuning in tonight. We hope you will join us in 2 weeks on the 25th, where we will continue the topic of grief. Actually, we will have Dr. Sarah Purcell, and she will be talking about her new book, Spectacle of Grief, Public Funerals and Memory in the Civil War era. So we're just gonna call it Mourning March. So join us again in a couple weeks. And again, Angela, thank you so very much for joining us. This was great.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you so much for this unhappy happy hour. And I really appreciate all the questions. So
Thanks.
Yay, thank you. Y'all have a good weekend.